quiet morning turned into a moment that shook an entire courthouse when arrogance collided with hidden authority, and a single act of cruelty unleashed consequences no one in that room was prepared to face. The story that follows is not about routine injustice, but about what happens when power miscalculates and truth rises from the very seat it tried to silence. Piece by piece, the events will lead you to a revelation so dramatic it redefined the meaning of accountability. If stories of courage standing against corruption speak to you, remember to like, subscribe, and share in the comments where you are watching from so your voice becomes part of the conversation. Kesha Williams had lived her entire professional life as both a woman and a Black American, constantly aware of the weight her identity carried in every room she entered. In the legal profession, where power, prestige, and appearances meant everything, she had fought for decades to prove that her brilliance, her command of the law, and her unshakable sense of justice defined her, not the color of her skin. Yet, as she walked that crisp morning toward the courthouse she had presided over for 23 years, none of that mattered to the man waiting at the top of the steps. Officer Martinez, a figure of arrogance in a neatly pressed uniform, did not see a judge who had earned respect across the state. He did not see a Harvard-trained lawyer who had built her career prosecuting civil rights violations before joining the bench. He saw only a Black woman in civilian clothes carrying a briefcase, and in his eyes, that was enough to make her suspect, enough to make her less than human. She carried her briefcase like any professional starting her day, filled with case files and memoranda she planned to review before the first hearing. She had no robe on, no gavel in her hand, no entourage announcing her authority. For once, she was simply herself, stripped of the trappings of judicial power. But her natural dignity remained intact in every step she took. As she approached, Martinez shifted, blocking her way deliberately. His smirk widened as his gaze raked over her. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. The words were like acid, but she had heard worse in her life. As a Black woman grown up in the South, she had endured years of insults, taunts, and slurs hurled at her by people who underestimated her worth. She had learned to steel herself, to look straight ahead, to keep moving forward. She tried to do the same now, but Martinez wasn't going to let her pass. He stepped closer, towering over her with a sneer of absolute contempt. Without warning, his hand swung and landed across her face. The sound of the slap cracked through the morning air. Her head snapped sideways, and pain flared across her cheek, hot and sharp. The blow knocked the briefcase from her hand, sending legal documents spilling across the courthouse steps. Papers fluttered everywhere, catching in the wind, evidence of the professionalism and responsibility she carried with her every day. Martinez did not care. His eyes gleamed with sadistic satisfaction as he lunged forward, seizing her by the throat and shoving her against the cold stone wall. His grip was hard, fingers pressing into her skin as if he wanted to erase her very breath. "Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses," he spat, his words so vile they cut deeper than the slap itself. For a Black woman who had dedicated her entire life to justice, the insult struck a wound centuries old, tied to generations of dehumanization and cruelty. She winced, but kept her gaze fixed on the bronze plaque mounted above the courthouse entrance. The Honorable Judge K. Williams presiding. Just feet away from where she was assaulted, her own name proclaimed her authority, her rightful place in this space. Yet here she was, handcuffed like a criminal, demeaned like a trespasser. Martinez twisted her arms behind her back and snapped on steel cuffs with unnecessary force. The bite of metal against her wrist drew a small gasp, but she would not give him the satisfaction of crying out. Other officers began to gather, drawn to the spectacle. Instead of stopping him, they laughed. Some pulled out their phones to record, their chuckles filling the air with an ugliness that seemed to echo off the courthouse walls. The scene felt like a grotesque reversal of justice. The very men sworn to protect the law were breaking it with gleeful cruelty, while the woman sworn to uphold justice was treated like a criminal. Inside her, a fire burned. She wanted to shout to reveal who she was, but she refused to give them that victory. She would not beg, would not cry out for them to stop, would not surrender her dignity. Instead, she stood as tall as the cuffs allowed, eyes still locked on that plaque, holding her identity close to her chest. Martinez leaned in close, his voice dripping with mockery. "People like you always pretend to be something important, but I know your kind. Not today. His ignorance was staggering. He had no idea that the woman he had slapped, insulted, and cuffed was the federal judge whose courtroom he stood in regularly, the same judge who had once signed off on warrants he requested, the same judge whose rulings had shaped his cases. His blindness to her humanity blinded him to the truth of her authority. As he dragged her toward the entrance, Kesha's mind sharpened with resolve. Every detail, every insult, every laugh from the officers around him, she etched it all into memory. Her cheek throbbed with pain, her wrist stung under the pressure of the cuffs, but inside she carried something stronger than his cruelty: knowledge. She knew this moment was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of his downfall. Each step across the courthouse threshold felt surreal, like crossing into an alternate reality where power was inverted. Officer Martinez straightened his uniform, squared his shoulders, and prepared for the performance he had rehearsed countless times. He had assaulted citizens before and always managed to twist the narrative until he looked like the hero. He knew the script by heart. Suspicious individual, refusal to comply, minimal force necessary. It was a story he told so often it had become second nature, and the system had always rewarded him by believing every word. He walked into the courtroom as if nothing unusual had happened, as if dragging a bruised woman into custody was an act of service rather than cruelty. The temporary judge, Harrison, a pale man in his 60s with thinning hair and a tired face, sat behind the bench, flipping through notes. He looked up, his expression bored, until Martinez began to speak. "Your Honor," Martinez said, voice steady and confident, "I was conducting routine security protocols when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security." He gestured toward Kesha with casual disdain, as if she were just another low-level criminal wasting the court's time. All eyes shifted to her. She sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her posture calm despite the handcuffs. The bruise on her cheek was a vivid mark of the violence she had endured, yet no one in that room rushed to her defense. Martinez continued, warming to his own lies. The defendant was acting erratically, refusing to provide identification, and became increasingly agitated when asked to comply with standard security procedures. Judge Harrison nodded, the familiar narrative fitting neatly into his expectations. He had presided over enough hearings to hear similar stories again and again, and he, like so many others, believed that an officer's testimony carried the weight of truth while a black defendant's words rarely did. Martinez pressed forward. She was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings and carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents, he claimed, his eyes gleaming as he fabricated details with confidence. When I approached to investigate, she became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making threats. His words dripped with disdain as he looked at her. These people always claim to be someone important: lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. I've seen this playbook before. Harrison leaned forward, interested. "Did she attempt to resist?" he asked. Martinez nodded firmly. "Absolutely. She became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody. I used only the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety." His voice rang with righteousness, and for a moment the courtroom seemed convinced. Other officers, Rodriguez and Thompson, exchanged smirks in the gallery, their presence meant to reinforce Martinez's account. They had seen him spin lies before and knew exactly how this story would go. The prosecutor, Sandra Walsh, a middle-aged woman with neatly styled hair and a firm tone, nodded along with Martinez's every word, already prepared to push for charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on an officer. The system was aligning against Kesha, just as it had against so many before her. Martinez pulled out his phone and offered what he called evidence, a video that conveniently began after his initial assault. "Unfortunately, my body cam malfunctioned this morning," he said smoothly, "but I do have partial footage." The video showed Kesha in handcuffs, her expression calm, but her appearance disheveled, making it easy for the uninformed eye to see her as the aggressor. "How convenient," Kesha murmured under her breath, her first words since the ordeal began, her voice sharp with restrained fury. Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Did you say something?" She met his gaze, her tone steady. "Nothing, Your Honor." Martinez pushed on, emboldened. What we have here is someone playing the victim card after being caught breaking the law. She was trespassing on government property, carrying suspicious documents, and when confronted, she immediately claimed discrimination. It's a calculated manipulation. He looked toward Walsh, who nodded sympathetically, then added, "In my 15 years of service, I've encountered similar situations. There's a pattern here." Certain individuals believe they're above the law, that rules don't apply to them, and they use accusations of racism to deflect from their crimes. It's insulting to real victims of discrimination. His voice rose with conviction, and several people in the gallery, mostly white courthouse employees, nodded in agreement. They had heard these words before, on the news, in courtrooms, in conversations that reinforced their assumptions. It was a comfortable narrative, one they accepted without question. Thompson stepped forward to add his voice. "If I may, Your Honor, the defendant was carrying confidential legal documents. We suspect she may have been involved in identity theft or fraud." Judge Harrison looked intrigued, his interest piqued by the suggestion of a larger crime. Martinez seized the momentum. "Yes, exactly. Documents with judicial letterhead, case numbers, sensitive information. No legitimate citizen would have access to these. She may have been planning to impersonate court personnel." The irony of his words nearly suffocated the room, but Martinez pressed on, convinced of his own brilliance. The prosecutor stood and announced the state's intention to pursue charges. Martinez allowed himself a small smile, but silence did not mean weakness, and while her lips pressed together in control, her mind recorded every syllable, every glance exchanged between the officers, every smirk that confirmed they were all part of a well-practiced performance. Now the prosecutor called Rodriguez, and the man rose from the gallery with his uniform immaculate, his posture disciplined, his voice steady as if he were reading a rehearsed script. "Yes, Your Honor, I witnessed the entire incident." The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols. Officer Martinez handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. The words carried the weight of certainty, and Harrison leaned forward with interest, jotting notes as though Rodriguez's testimony were gospel truth. Kesha's jaw tightened, not with fear, but with fury disguised as composure, for she knew the truth, and she knew Rodriguez had been nowhere near the steps when Martinez first struck her. She could still hear the echo of their laughter as they arrived only after the assault had already begun, pulling out phones to record instead of intervening. Yet here he stood, lying smoothly under oath, an accomplice to the perjury now filling the official record. Judge Harrison asked for details. "And the alleged assault?" Rodriguez nodded gravely. "Your Honor, I can confirm that Martinez used only the minimum necessary force to subdue the defendant, who was combative and threatening courthouse security. The defendant's injuries, if any, resulted entirely from her own resistance." His phrasing was precise, honed from years of watching Martinez craft stories that painted brutality as restraint, cruelty as professionalism, and injustice as protection. Harrison accepted it with a satisfied nod, while the stenographer's fingers clattered, capturing every false word into permanent transcript. The prosecutor turned to Thompson next, another officer whose face bore the expression of rehearsed indignation. "Yes, ma'am," Thompson answered when asked if he corroborated Martinez's account. "The defendant was carrying documents with sensitive information, and based on my training and experience, they appeared stolen. We suspected she might have been engaged in identity theft or planning fraud." Officer Martinez was right to intervene, and his response was appropriate given her aggression. He spoke with confidence, embellishing Martinez's tale with even darker implications, laying the groundwork for charges that could have destroyed any ordinary citizen's life. The prosecutor seized on the suggestion, presenting it to Judge Harrison as further evidence of guilt. Fraud, trespassing, resisting arrest, each charge stacked one upon the other, like bricks in a wall designed to bury the truth. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward Kesha, some filled with disdain, others with the casual indifference of those who had seen similar cases before. In their minds, the narrative was complete. A suspicious black woman carrying papers she shouldn't have had, resisting authority, playing the victim card when caught. It was a story they recognized because it had been told so many times before, on the news, in courtrooms, in hushed conversations around water coolers, and each time it ended the same way, with the accused silenced and the officer praised. Martinez stood tall, his expression calm, but his hands betrayed him with a faint tremor, a tiny crack in the mask of confidence he wore. He had played this role countless times, but something about the way Kesha's eyes remained locked on him unsettled him. There was no fear in her gaze, no desperation, only a silent fury and an iron control that whispered of truths he did not yet understand. The stenographer's keys tapped like hammers striking nails, sealing his lies into the record. In the back row, a young law clerk furrowed her brow. Something about the defendant's voice, her mannerisms, her calm precision gnawed at her memory, but she could not quite place it. Meanwhile, the gallery absorbed the performance with a mixture of boredom and validation. Some nodded along with Martinez's righteous indignation, some whispered agreement with Rodriguez and Thompson, and others merely sat waiting for the inevitable conclusion they had seen countless times before. The prosecutor, sensing victory, pressed Martinez to recount once again the defendant's supposed aggression. He repeated his lines, this time adding flourishes of indignation. These people think they can waltz into any building, any courtroom, and when they're stopped, they scream discrimination. But not in my courthouse. His words carried through the chamber, poisoning the air, each syllable dripping with the arrogance of unchecked power. Kesha sat motionless, but inside, she was burning. She listened as they painted her as an imposter, as a criminal, as a threat, and she took note of every word, every exaggeration, every slander. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, the history of every black defendant who had sat where she sat now, powerless against lies bolstered by uniforms and badges. But unlike those before her, she was not powerless. She was a federal judge, and though they did not know it yet, every lie spoken today would soon collapse under the crushing weight of truth. Martinez concluded his performance with a flourish, emphasizing his restraint and professionalism, claiming he had shown mercy by not using more force, claiming she might have been on narcotics, painting her as unstable and dangerous. Harrison nodded gravely, taking in every lie as though it were truth carved in stone. For Martinez, it felt like another victory, another demonstration that the system would always believe him, always protect him, always validate his cruelty. He even allowed himself a smile, a small glimmer of triumph flashing across his lips as if he had already won. But across the courtroom, still and silent, Kesha's lips curled almost imperceptibly at the corners. It was not a smile of defeat, but the faintest shadow of what was to come. She had endured humiliation, pain, and false testimony, but her dignity was intact, and her knowledge of the law was a weapon sharper than any blade. As Martinez basked in his illusion of dominance, for a moment the atmosphere was weighted with inevitability, as though nothing could shift the tide of this proceeding, as though the defendant was already condemned in the minds of all who watched. But then, for the first time since the slap on the courthouse steps, Judge Kesha Williams lifted her head with purpose, her eyes steady, her posture unyielding, and her voice clear as a bell. She had allowed them their performance, allowed them to pile lie upon lie, and now she began the process of dismantling everything with precision. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but laced with authority, "I would like the opportunity to clarify several factual inaccuracies presented in Officer Martinez's testimony." The words rolled across the room like a slow tide, and for the first time, Harrison looked unsettled, caught off guard by the control in her tone. He had expected anger or tears or desperation, but what he heard was the cadence of someone who knew the law intimately, who had spoken in courtrooms for decades, and who was comfortable under the scrutiny of dozens of eyes. She continued without hesitation, her voice measured, deliberate, and cutting through the haze of deception. "According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 this morning. As you know, public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present. The Supreme Court's ruling in HGV Committee for Industrial Organization confirms this right unequivocally." The stenographer's fingers paused for half a heartbeat, the prosecutor frowned, and Harrison blinked as though reminded of precedents he had not expected a defendant to invoke. Kesha pressed on, seizing the small cracks opening in their certainty. "Officer Martinez also testified that I carried suspicious documents suggesting identity theft or fraud. I would like the court to examine that claim more closely." Those papers are authentic legal materials, pending case files, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity. She gestured toward the evidence table where her scattered documents had been gathered. Walsh rose, objecting quickly, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to present herself as someone of legal authority without representation." But Kesha turned, her gaze so steady that Walsh faltered. "Your Honor, pro se defendants have the constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense." Furthermore, Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's obligation to preserve exculpatory evidence, and that obligation applies here. The gallery went still, the words sinking in. This was not the frantic rambling of a guilty suspect, but the precise argumentation of someone who had lived her life inside the law. Martinez's confidence flickered as he shifted uncomfortably, realizing too late that the woman he had slapped and cuffed was not merely educated, but dangerously so for his false narrative. Kesha's voice grew sharper, each sentence landing like a hammer against the fragile shell of their lies. Officer Martinez further claimed that his body camera malfunctioned. Yet this courthouse is equipped with extensive surveillance, including high-definition cameras positioned at intervals along the main approach, all with automatic backup systems. I request this court issue a preservation order for all surveillance data from 8:45 to 9:15 this morning, including but not limited to security footage, body cam backups, and any mobile phone recordings made by officers present. She let the words settle, their weight undeniable. Judge Harrison shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed as though struggling to reconcile the script he had accepted with the undeniable authority of her argument. The gallery began to murmur, whispers rippling as spectators exchanged uneasy glances. Henderson, the bailiff who had served the courthouse for 12 years, stared at her with dawning recognition, the color draining from his face as fragments of realization snapped into place. She was no ordinary defendant. He had seen her face every day in robes on the bench, commanding the courtroom with the authority of law. Martinez clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists at his sides, but his power was already slipping. The web of lies he had woven so confidently was beginning to unravel thread by thread, and the calm, surgical dismantling by the woman he had underestimated left him shaken. Kesha leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping lower, forcing everyone to strain to hear. "Your Honor, I also request that the record reflect my professional background be verified before this proceeding continues." She paused deliberately, then allowed the smallest trace of a smile to touch her lips. "My name is Williams, Dr. Williams." Martinez's chest tightened, unease flooding his body. Though he could not yet comprehend the full gravity of what was being revealed, Judge Harrison cleared his throat, uncomfortable but compelled. "And what exactly is your profession, Ms. Williams?" Her answer was measured, controlled, a subtle warning wrapped in civility. "I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor. We will get to that shortly." The tension in the room thickened. The officers in the gallery shifted nervously, Rodriguez glancing at Thompson with a flash of doubt. The prosecutor's pen hesitated mid-stroke. Even the stenographer's rhythm faltered for an instant before resuming. Henderson's hands trembled slightly at his sides, his eyes wide as the truth sank deeper into his bones. He knew who she was, and his silence was becoming unbearable. Kesha straightened her posture, bruised but unbroken, restrained but untouchable in spirit, her voice steady and resonant. "I attempted to show my identification to Officer Martinez before he initiated his assault. He refused to examine it. That identification remains in my possession alongside my judicial parking pass and building access card. These documents will conclusively establish my identity and my legitimate reason for being here this morning." Her words landed like cannon fire, shaking the illusion Martinez had worked so hard to build. His arrogance faltered, his polished routine cracking under the relentless precision of her legal counterattack. He looked at her, but for the first time it was not with contempt, it was with fear, though he tried desperately to hide it. Kesha's calm remained absolute. Every insult, every blow, every false testimony had been fuel for this moment, and though her robes were not yet on her shoulders, she carried herself with the unmistakable dignity of a judge reclaiming her rightful place. The courtroom had shifted. She had requested preservation of evidence, cited precedents with precision, and invoked rights that most defendants never knew how to articulate, much less wield with such exacting control. The room had shifted. The arrogance of Martinez and the smug conviction of his fellow officers had been shaken, though not yet destroyed, because the prosecutor clung to her narrative and Judge Harrison still wore the mask of procedural neutrality. Yet something deeper had begun to unravel, and it was in that unraveling that Henderson, the bailiff who had served this courthouse faithfully for 12 years, found himself staring at the woman he thought was a stranger and seeing someone he knew all too well. Henderson's gaze locked on her features, the measured way she spoke, the deliberate pauses, the cadence of authority and recognition struck him like a blow. His mouth went dry, his hands trembled, and he suddenly realized that the defendant in cuffs was not some unknown troublemaker. He had seen her nearly every day for years, walking the halls in robes, commanding the courtroom with grace, issuing rulings that carried the weight of law. He had stood when she entered. He had announced her presence with the reverence due to her station. And now he watched in horror as she sat shackled, her dignity assaulted, her identity erased by the arrogance of officers who had failed to look beyond their prejudice. Henderson felt the blood drain from his face as the truth crystallized inside him, but fear of speaking out froze him in place. He understood that one wrong word could shift the fragile balance of power in this room and ignite chaos, yet silence burned him like fire. Meanwhile, Martinez tried to steady his breathing, but the crack in his confidence was widening. Keisha's invocation of her professional capacity lingered in his mind, each syllable echoing with menace, though he still clung to the belief that his authority as an officer could overpower the inconvenient truth of who she really was. His palms grew slick with sweat, and though his jaw remained tight, the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Judge Harrison cleared his throat uneasily, his pen hovering above his notes. The defendant's calm and deliberate statements did not align with the profile Martinez had painted, and though Harrison had long been inclined to favor officers' testimony, even he could not deny the faint stirrings of doubt. He tried to mask it, tried to maintain control of the courtroom, but his eyes betrayed him as they darted between Martinez, Walsh, and the woman seated before him. Walsh rose to challenge Keisha again, her tone sharp, but the prosecutor's words lacked the earlier confidence. "Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to manipulate legal language to confuse the issue," she insisted. "She is clearly not an attorney, and her claims should be dismissed as irrelevant." Keisha turned her gaze on Walsh with the kind of piercing clarity that could slice through steel. "Irrelevant?" she repeated softly, the word dripping with disdain. "Your Honor, the right to present exculpatory evidence is not irrelevant. The duty of this court to ensure a fair proceeding is not irrelevant. The preservation of evidence is not irrelevant. What is irrelevant is the fiction Officer Martinez has attempted to pass as truth." Her words hit like hammer blows, and Walsh faltered, her composure cracking under the weight of the defendant's authority. Rodriguez and Thompson shifted uncomfortably, their earlier smirks evaporating as they realized the foundation of Martinez's narrative was being dismantled brick by brick. The gallery murmured now, the tide of whispers rising, and though Harrison banged his gavel to silence them, the doubt had already seated itself in their minds. Martinez, sensing the room slip away from him, leaned forward and tried to reclaim control. "Your Honor," he said, forcing his voice into steadiness, "this is exactly what I warned about. These people always claim to be someone important when they are caught. This is nothing but a ploy to avoid accountability." But the words rang hollow now, devoid of the easy authority they had once carried. For the first time in his career, his narrative was not being swallowed whole. Instead, it was being dissected by the very woman he had tried to erase. Keisha sat tall, her wrists bound, her body aching, but her spirit burning brighter than the fluorescent lights overhead. She had no need to raise her voice. The quiet conviction in her tone carried more weight than Martinez's shouted denials. She knew the power of silence, of precision, of timing, and now she wielded them with lethal efficiency. Her eyes swept the courtroom, settling momentarily on Henderson, whose pale face and trembling hands betrayed his recognition. She did not speak to him directly, but her gaze told him she knew he understood, and that knowledge gave him no escape. He swallowed hard, torn between duty and fear, between silence and truth. Martinez pressed his palms against the table, desperate to maintain dominance. "Your Honor, she's lying. She has no proof of anything she claims." But the words fell flat, and as if on cue, Kesha spoke again. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I attempted to present identification at the time of my arrest. Officer Martinez refused to examine it. That identification remains in my possession, and when it is examined, it will confirm my legitimate reason for being here this morning." She allowed the silence that followed to stretch long, forcing every person in the courtroom to sit with the weight of her words. Henderson's lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but he stopped himself, the internal battle raging across his face for all to see. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, unease gnawing at him, because he could not dismiss her words the way he had dismissed the testimony of countless defendants before. There was something about her, the way she spoke, the way she held herself even in shackles, that demanded respect, even from him. Walsh's pen tapped nervously against her pad, a small but telling sign of her unraveling confidence. The gallery, once complacent in its agreement with Martinez's story, now leaned forward, eyes wide, waiting for the next revelation. The air grew thick with anticipation, the sense that something monumental was about to be unveiled pressing down on every chest. Prosecutor Walsh had huddled with her notes, her pen tapping nervously, her arguments no longer carrying the confidence they had before. Rodriguez and Thompson had retreated toward the gallery, whispering in hushed tones, unease shadowing their earlier bravado. And in the corner, Bailiff Henderson had stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, knowing he had recognized the woman in chains as the very judge he had introduced in court for more than a decade. That knowledge alone shook him to his core, because he had allowed the charade to continue, too afraid to speak the truth in front of so many powerful faces. But as the 15-minute recess began, Henderson gathered his courage, walked to the holding room where she had been placed, and found himself face to face with the woman he had announced so many times before. She sat calmly, her hands still cuffed, her bruise stark against her skin, but her eyes sharp and steady as though she carried no fear at all. He fumbled with his keys, his voice cracking as he whispered, "Judge Williams, Jesus Christ, Judge Williams, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you in civilian clothes, and when they brought you in like that." His words trailed off in shame, his hands shaking as he realized the full scope of what had just happened. She looked at him with calm authority, her voice steady, forgiving, but firm. "It's all right, Henderson, you weren't part of this, but I need you to do something for me." He straightened instantly, every ounce of his loyalty rushing back to her. "Anything, Your Honor, anything at all." Her eyes locked on his. "I need you to go to my chambers quietly and bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim. And, Henderson," she paused, her tone soft but commanding, "bring my gavel too, the engraved one from my swearing-in ceremony." He nodded vigorously, his throat tight, then rushed from the room to carry out her request. Left alone, Kesha closed her eyes and took a deep breath, centering herself with the discipline she had mastered over decades on the bench. This morning she had left her home as Judge Kesha Williams, a woman who had presided over thousands of cases, a woman known for her fairness and her commitment to the Constitution. By the steps of her own courthouse, she had been stripped of her title, her dignity assaulted, her authority mocked. In the span of minutes, she had been reduced to a victim, bound and humiliated before the very people who should have recognized her. But now, with the tide shifting, it was time to reclaim her place. When Henderson returned, his hands carried both the garment bag and the small wooden box that contained the ceremonial gavel. His eyes glistened with both relief and dread as he handed them to her, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Your robes, Your Honor, and your gavel." She stood, unzipping the bag, and revealed the flowing black robes trimmed in gold that had been her armor for 23 years. As she slipped them on, she felt the transformation ignite within her. The fabric carried the weight of justice, each fold reminding her of the oaths she had sworn, each thread a symbol of the authority she embodied. She opened the box and lifted out her gavel, its polished wood gleaming under the light, the engraving on its handle catching her eye. Justice is blind, but she sees all. She held it in her hand, its weight familiar, comforting, and absolute. She turned to Henderson. "When we return to the courtroom, I want you to announce me properly." His voice trembled. "Yes, Your Honor. How would you like to be announced?" She straightened to her full height, her shoulders squared, her presence radiating authority. "The Honorable Judge Kesha Williams presiding." Henderson nodded, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Yes, Your Honor." She glanced in a mirror on the wall, her reflection showing both the bruise on her cheek and the robes flowing around her shoulders. But the bruise no longer represented humiliation. It was evidence, it was testimony, it was proof of the brutality she had endured. And now, draped in the robes of her office, it was also a symbol of resilience, of the justice about to be restored. She returned to the courtroom through the judge's chamber door, each step deliberate, each movement infused with the dignity that came from decades of commanding a bench. Henderson's voice boomed, louder and steadier than ever before, echoing through the chamber. "All rise. Court is now in session." "The Honorable Judge Kesha Williams presiding." The words struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Prosecutor Walsh's mouth fell open. Judge Harrison turned pale, realizing in horror that he had been occupying a seat that was never his to hold. Martinez, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, went rigid, his face draining of color as he struggled to comprehend the reality before him. Kesha walked with measured grace to her rightful bench, the gold trim of her robes catching the overhead light, the gavel firm in her hand. The silence in the room was absolute. No one dared breathe, no one dared move. She took her seat slowly, deliberately, reclaiming the throne of justice that had been hers all along. Her eyes swept the room, resting finally on Martinez, whose knees were threatening to buckle beneath him. Her voice, calm yet carrying the full weight of judicial authority, cut through the silence. "Officer Martinez, you may remain standing." His lips parted, but no words came. His swagger was gone, his confidence shattered, his arrogance stripped bare. Judge Harrison rose clumsily, stammering, "Your Honor, we didn't." She interrupted him with a crisp but not unkind tone. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay, Judge Harrison. You may return to your own docket. I will handle this matter from here." He nodded quickly, relief and shame washing over him as he fled the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him like a man running from ghosts. All eyes returned to Kesha as she turned her gaze back to Martinez. She spoke with the steady calm of someone who had already won. "Approximately 2 hours ago, Officer Martinez, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" His lips moved, but his voice failed him, a hoarse sound escaping instead of words. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "Let me refresh your memory. You stated, and I quote, 'These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability.' I've seen this playbook before. Do you remember saying that?" Martinez's face shifted from red to white to a sickly green, his body trembling as he nodded weakly. Officer Martinez stood trembling, his face drained of all color, his arrogance obliterated, his body betraying him with every nervous twitch. The prosecutor had dropped her pen, her notes scattered across the table, her earlier confidence stripped away by the revelation that the woman they had mocked and brutalized was the presiding judge of this very courthouse. Rodriguez and Thompson shrank into their seats, their uniforms suddenly feeling like costumes of shame rather than symbols of authority. Kesha allowed the silence to linger for a long moment, her gaze sweeping across the room until every person felt the weight of her eyes. Then, with deliberate calm, she reached beneath the bench and lifted a tablet that Henderson had placed discreetly on her desk. "Officer Martinez," she said, her voice steady but carrying a blade's edge, "I would like to show you some evidence that has just come to my attention." She turned the screen so that all could see, her finger tapping the play icon. The tablet came alive with crystal clear footage from courthouse security camera number 7, an angle positioned perfectly to capture the main entrance. The image showed Kesha walking calmly toward the courthouse in her civilian clothes, her briefcase in hand, her posture professional and composed. The room watched in horror as Martinez stepped into her path, sneered at her, and then unleashed the words that now reverberated through the speakers. "Another ghetto rat trying to sneak in." A gasp rippled through the gallery, the poison of his contempt amplified by the undeniable clarity of the recording. The video continued, showing him slapping her with such force that her head snapped sideways, the briefcase flying from her hand, papers scattering across the steps. The footage captured him grabbing her by the throat, shoving her against the wall, snapping handcuffs on her wrists while other officers laughed and recorded with their phones. The coup de grace came when his voice hissed with venom. Filthy animals like you belong in cages, not courthouses. The courtroom erupted with gasps and murmurs, some spectators covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disgust. The jurors waiting for other cases in the gallery rose from their seats and walked out in outrage, unable to stomach what they had just witnessed. Kesha paused the video and fixed Martinez with her gaze. "Officer Martinez, do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats?" He remained silent, his mouth opening and closing like a drowning man, his career disintegrating before his eyes. She swiped the screen again. "Now let's examine your claim that your body cam malfunctioned." A new file appeared and the room grew even more tense. "This is backup footage from your body camera, automatically uploaded to the county's cloud storage system every 60 seconds. A system you apparently forgot existed." She tapped play, and the courtroom was filled with Martinez's voice, snarling words that burned through the speakers like acid. "Look at this uppity bitch thinking she can just walk into my courthouse. These people need to learn their place. Time to teach another lesson." The gasps returned, louder this time, accompanied by outright disgust from the spectators. Walsh's face turned ashen, her hands fumbling to collect her papers as if to distance herself from the catastrophe unfolding at her table. Kesha advanced the footage to show Martinez slapping and cuffing her from his own body cam perspective. "Here we see the moment when Officer Martinez committed felony assault against a federal judge," she said, her tone precise, her authority absolute. "And let us remember, this is his own body cam, his own words, his own actions." Martinez's knees buckled, and he collapsed into the nearest chair, his face buried in his hands, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. But Kesha wasn't finished. She swiped to another file. "This," she said, "is audio captured by Officer Thompson's body camera." The recording played, revealing Thompson's voice speaking to Rodriguez while Martinez brutalized Kesha. "Dude's really going off on this one. Think she's actually somebody important like she keeps saying?" Rodriguez's voice responded with a mocking laugh. "Nah, man, look at her. Martinez knows what he's doing. Probably just another welfare queen trying to scam the system." Laughter followed, cruel and damning, recorded forever as proof of their complicity. The courtroom's air grew toxic with disgust. Several people in the gallery turned on Rodriguez and Thompson, their faces twisted with revulsion, their earlier nods of agreement now erased by shame. Kesha set the tablet down and leaned forward slightly. "Officers Rodriguez and Thompson, you both testified under oath that Officer Martinez handled the situation with professionalism. Would you like to revise those statements?" The two men sat frozen, sweat beading on their foreheads, their eyes darting toward the exit as if escape were possible. Their silence screamed louder than any words could. Kesha rose from her seat, her robes flowing around her, her voice growing colder with each word. "For the record, I have been the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years. Every case Officer Martinez has testified in, every warrant he has requested, every search he has conducted in this jurisdiction has been under my authority. He stood in this very courtroom dozens of times before me, and yet today he claimed not to recognize me. He claimed I was a criminal. He claimed I was carrying stolen documents. He claimed I was trespassing. Every one of those statements was a lie." She lifted the gavel and held it aloft. "And now, with this evidence, we know his lies for what they are: perjury, felony assault, and civil rights violations." Martinez sobbed quietly, his body shaking. The swagger that had once defined him dissolved into nothing. He whispered, "Your Honor, I didn't know. I never meant." Kesha's eyes burned with fire as she cut him off. "You didn't know because you didn't look. You didn't know because you didn't care. You saw a black woman and you made assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless and you decided to abuse that power. But you were wrong, Officer Martinez. Dead wrong." She placed the gavel back on the bench with a deliberate click, the sound echoing like a verdict yet to come. She gestured to Henderson. "Mark for the record that this court has reviewed direct video and audio evidence of Officer Martinez's assault on a federal judge. Mark also for the record that his fellow officers knowingly lied under oath to support his false testimony." Martinez sat collapsed in his chair, his head buried in his trembling hands, his body a shrunken shadow of the arrogant officer who had strutted into court hours earlier. Rodriguez and Thompson shifted uneasily, their faces pale, their eyes darting toward the exits as if escape were possible, though both of them knew they were bound by their complicity. Prosecutor Walsh shuffled her papers with trembling hands, her attempts to appear composed faltering under the sheer magnitude of what had just been revealed. But Kesha was far from finished. She straightened in her chair, the black robes draped across her shoulders like armor, the engraved gavel resting firmly in her grasp, the bruise on her cheek not a mark of shame but a badge of evidence that spoke louder than words. She looked around the courtroom, her eyes sweeping deliberately from one corner to another, making sure every single person understood that this proceeding was no longer about a fabricated trespassing charge. This was about corruption, about abuse, about systemic rot that had festered unchecked for far too long. Her voice rang clear and steady. We have now seen undeniable evidence of Officer Martinez's assault on a federal judge, his perjury, and the complicity of his fellow officers. But this morning's crimes are not an isolated incident. They are the culmination of a long and disturbing pattern, a pattern that this court can no longer ignore. She reached to her side and lifted a thick file from the bench, its contents bound together with a clip that struggled to contain the sheer volume of documents within. The room stirred with whispers as she set it down with a heavy thud that echoed across the chamber. This file, she declared, contains detailed records of every case Officer Martinez has testified in over the past 5 years, along with complaint reports filed with Internal Affairs, arrest statistics, and settlement payouts made by this county as a result of his conduct. She opened the file and flipped through the first pages. According to records from Internal Affairs, Officer Martinez has been the subject of 47 formal complaints during his 15-year career. 47. That averages to more than 3 complaints every year. And yet, according to his department's own investigations, nearly every single one was deemed unsubstantiated. She lifted her eyes and locked them on Martinez, whose breathing grew ragged as the numbers pierced through the last of his defenses. The gallery buzzed with murmurs of disbelief. Let us review some of these complaints, she continued, her voice precise, almost surgical. Complaint number 1, filed in 2009, Mrs. San Rosa Delgado, a 63-year-old grandmother, alleged that Officer Martinez called her a racial slur during a routine traffic stop and slammed her face into the hood of her own car when she asked for his badge number. The department deemed her allegations unsubstantiated. Complaint number 12, 2012, Jamal Washington, a 17-year-old honor student, alleged that Martinez planted narcotics in his backpack after he refused to provide information about his older brother. The case was dismissed, and again, the department deemed the complaint unsubstantiated. Complaint number 23, 2016, Dr. Rady Michael Johnson, a prominent cardiologist, alleged that Martinez arrested him outside his own home because he did not believe a black man could live in that neighborhood. Dr. Johnson spent 6 hours in jail before his attorney secured his release. The department's conclusion? Unsubstantiated. Each example landed like a hammer, shattering what little remained of Martinez's credibility. Walsh lowered her head, unable to meet Kesha's gaze, her pen frozen above her notes. Harrison, who had tried to maintain neutrality, now sat rigid, his face drawn with unease, realizing that he had almost overseen one of the most grotesque miscarriages of justice in his career. Kesha turned another page and revealed a large chart, placing it upright on an easel beside her bench so the entire courtroom could see. Over his career, Officer Martinez has made 1,253 arrests. Of those arrests, 1,089 involved people of color. That is 87%, despite the demographics of his patrol area being 42% white, 31% Hispanic, and 27% black. His use of force reports show that he used physical force in 63% of his arrests involving people of color, compared to only 12% involving white suspects. She pointed to the figures with a laser pointer, each statistic flashing like a red alarm in the minds of everyone present. Even more damning, she continued, of those 1,089 arrests of people of color, 432 cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, or violations of constitutional rights. That is a dismissal rate of nearly 40%. Officer Martinez, do you know what we call it when an officer's cases are dismissed at such a rate for violations of constitutional rights? We call it a pattern of criminal behavior. The words sliced through the air with undeniable force. Martinez slumped deeper into his chair, his face gray, his eyes vacant, his chest rising and falling with shallow, defeated breaths. Kesha's tone hardened, each word pronounced like a verdict. And here is the financial impact of your actions. Over the past 15 years, this county has paid out more than $2.3 million in settlements and judgments directly related to your conduct. $2.3 million of taxpayer money wasted to cover your misconduct, your abuses, your violence. Money that could have funded schools, hospitals, community programs, instead spent to silence victims and protect your badge. The courtroom stirred with outrage, murmurs rising to near shouts until Henderson called for order. Kesha raised a hand, silencing the room herself, her authority absolute. She lifted a final document, reading aloud the oath Martinez had sworn when he became an officer. I solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the state constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of my office according to the best of my ability. So help me God. She slammed the document down. Faithfully and impartially, not selectively, not based on skin color, not based on your prejudice. Her words thundered through the chamber, every syllable a nail driven into the coffin of Martinez's career. The prosecutor sat frozen, Rodriguez and Thompson looked ready to bolt, and Martinez himself sat hunched, broken, the truth of his legacy laid bare for all to see. What we are witnessing here is not the misconduct of one rogue officer, Kesha declared, but the truth was undeniable now, etched into evidence, broadcast to every corner of the chamber by her steady voice. Martinez sat slumped in the defendant's chair, his head bowed, his eyes glassy with despair, his arrogance completely obliterated. The once confident officer who had strutted into the courtroom with a smirk and a script now resembled a hollow man, a shell crumbling under the unbearable weight of his own actions being exposed to the light. Rodriguez and Thompson sat frozen, their faces pale and damp with sweat, knowing their own lies had been recorded for eternity, knowing their complicity was etched into the body cam footage Kesha had revealed, knowing there would be no escaping the fallout. Prosecutor Walsh fumbled silently with her notes, her earlier determination shattered, her role in enabling this spectacle now an indelible stain on her career. The gallery had transformed from passive spectators to witnesses of history, their faces reflecting anger, sorrow, vindication, and awe as they absorbed the magnitude of what was happening before them. Kesha rose slowly from the bench, her black robes cascading like waves of authority, her gavel clutched firmly in her hand, her eyes burning with the fire of both indignation and justice. The silence was immediate, absolute, as though every person in the room instinctively knew that the next word she spoke would become part of history. She walked out from behind the bench, breaking the usual barrier between judge and courtroom, and moved closer to Martinez, who shrank further into his chair as her presence loomed over him. Her voice rang clear, deliberate, and unwavering. Officer Martinez, before we proceed with the serious criminal charges you now face, this court and every person present deserves to understand exactly who you assaulted this morning. She let her gaze sweep the room. Her words meant not just for him, but for everyone watching, everyone who had doubted, everyone who had accepted lies as truth. My name is Judge Kesha Williams. I have served as the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years. I was appointed to this position by Governor Richardson in 2001 and confirmed by the state Senate with a unanimous vote. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I was editor of the Harvard Law Review. Before my appointment to the bench, I served 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. During that time, I successfully prosecuted 47 cases against law enforcement officers who abused their authority. Her voice grew stronger with each word, her credentials stacking like iron beams reinforcing the foundation of truth. Martinez's attorney scribbled frantically, his pale face betraying the knowledge that his client was finished, that nothing he could argue would save him from the avalanche of evidence and authority descending upon him. Kesha turned sharply, her robes sweeping around her, and addressed the entire courtroom. In my 23 years on this bench, I have presided over more than 15,000 cases. I have sentenced criminals from petty thieves to murderers. I have heard every excuse, every justification, every story meant to bend the truth. But in all those years, never have I encountered such a perfect example of everything that is wrong with policing in America as what I witnessed this morning. Her eyes locked onto Martinez, her tone colder now, sharper, each word a blade. When you called me a filthy animal, when you told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, you were not just assaulting a citizen. You were assaulting justice itself. She returned to the bench, placed the file back down, and lifted a thicker folder marked with Martinez's name. This file contains not just your misconduct, but your entire career, Officer Martinez. 47 complaints, 432 dismissed cases, millions of dollars in settlements, years of unchecked violence, and yet you believed the system would always protect you. You believed your lies would always be believed. You believed your badge gave you immunity. She slammed the folder shut, the sound like a gunshot echoing across the chamber. But your greatest mistake was believing you could brutalize a judge on the steps of her own courthouse and walk away unscathed. The gavel rose in her hand, but instead of striking it down, she held it aloft, her voice booming with authority that seemed to shake the very walls. Officer Martinez, based on the evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence from your own mouth, your own hands, your own camera, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony. I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. And I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for your false testimony given under oath in this very courtroom. Each pronouncement struck Martinez like a blow, his body shrinking further with each declaration, his head sinking lower, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The gallery erupted in murmurs, the sound of justice finally breaking through the decades of silence. But Kesha raised her hand and silence fell again. She leaned forward, her eyes piercing Martinez like steel. But let me be clear, this case is not only about you. You are a symptom of a much larger disease, a disease that has infected our justice system for far too long. For years, we have allowed officers to operate with impunity, to dismiss complaints, to ignore evidence, to hide behind settlements and silence. For years, we have told victims of police brutality that their voices do not matter, that their word does not count, that justice is not for them. But that ends today. Her voice rose, fueled by decades of watching injustice pile upon injustice. What happened here today proves that no one is above the law. Not police officers, not prosecutors, not judges, not politicians. No one. The gallery thundered with applause, people rising to their feet, but Martinez broke down completely, his sobs filling the chamber, his shoulders shaking, his voice cracking with pitiful pleas. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't know, I never meant." She cut him off with an icy stare. "Your apology is 15 years and 47 complaints too late. Your remorse appears only now because you finally face consequences. But those consequences will be full and final." She lifted the gavel high above her head, her voice carrying like thunder. "Officer Martinez, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, let me tell you my place. My place is here, on this bench, ensuring justice is served. My place is making sure bullies like you never again hide behind a badge while destroying lives. My place is ensuring that what you did today will be the last act of racial violence you ever commit as an officer. And your place, Officer Martinez, is in that defendant's chair, facing the consequences of 15 years of criminal behavior." The gavel came down with a crack that shook the room. "Officer Martinez, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law. 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The gallery erupted again, this time in thunderous applause that lasted for minutes, the sound echoing like a hymn to justice. Henderson's voice boomed, "Order!" But there was no silencing the wave of vindication that had washed over the crowd. Kesha stood tall, her robes billowing, her bruise a badge of resilience, her gavel the instrument of a justice long denied. She looked out over the packed courtroom and spoke with finality. Let this be a message to every officer, every prosecutor, every official who believes they can abuse their power without consequence. Justice may be blind, but she sees everything, and she will always come. The thunderous crack of the gavel that sealed Martinez's 25-year sentence reverberated far beyond the walls of that single courtroom, sending shockwaves through a community that had grown numb from years of abuse, silence complaints, and unaccountable authority. For a moment, the applause inside the chamber seemed endless, a cathartic roar from people who had longed to see justice not as an idea, not as a slogan, but as a living reality. But what followed in the days, weeks, and months ahead would prove that the events of that morning were not merely the downfall of a single corrupt officer. They were the catalyst for a transformation that stretched across the county, the state, and eventually the nation. Martinez was transported to federal prison within days, placed under protective custody because the other inmates had already seen the footage that had gone viral across television and social media, footage of him calling a federal judge a filthy animal, slapping her across the face, and bragging about teaching her a lesson. The man who once strutted through neighborhoods with unchecked power now shuffled down sterile prison corridors, his uniform traded for an orange jumpsuit, his badge stripped away, his pension revoked, his reputation obliterated. He spent his days isolated, his name synonymous with disgrace, his power gone, his arrogance reduced to sobs in a cell where no one cared about his excuses. But Martinez's punishment was only the beginning. The federal investigation that Judge Williams ordered began immediately, and it revealed a tangled web of corruption within the police department. 12 officers were terminated outright. 4 supervisors were criminally charged for covering up misconduct and falsifying reports. Internal Affairs was gutted and rebuilt under federal oversight. Its new mandate clear: no more complaints would be dismissed as unsubstantiated without transparent review. Rodriguez and Thompson, whose recorded laughter had been played in court for all to hear, faced charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Their smirks on camera became evidence against them, and their downfall served as a stark warning to anyone who thought silence or complicity would shield them from accountability. Prosecutor Walsh was removed from her position, her career collapsing under the weight of her role in enabling Martinez's lies, her name forever linked to a case that exposed the rot of an entire system. The impact of Keisha's judgment reached the wrongfully accused as well. The 432 cases Martinez had tainted were reopened. Dozens of men and women who had spent years in prison for crimes they had not committed were released. Others had their charges dropped or sentences reduced. Families that had been torn apart by his misconduct wept with relief as their loved ones finally returned home. The county, forced to confront the staggering consequences of Martinez's career, paid out an additional $8.7 million in compensation, money that was taken directly from the police department's budget rather than the general taxpayer fund, a symbolic reminder that the institution responsible for the abuse would bear the cost of its corruption. The courthouse itself became a monument to the mourning justice reclaimed its voice. It was renamed the Justice Williams Federal Courthouse, a bronze plaque placed near the entrance reading simply, "Here, justice finally found its voice." Students of law visited the building to walk the steps where Kesha had been slapped, to stand in the courtroom where lies were dismantled, to feel the weight of history in the place where power was humbled. Law schools across the nation invited Judge Williams to speak, and she delivered a message that became her hallmark. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered is justice for all. Her speeches were broadcast widely, her words studied and debated, her presence a beacon for young lawyers who sought to dedicate their careers to defending the rights of the vulnerable. The community itself underwent a transformation. Citizens who had been too afraid to file complaints against police misconduct began stepping forward, emboldened by the knowledge that their voices would no longer be dismissed. Community oversight boards were established, giving ordinary people a seat at the table in reviewing police actions. Training programs for officers were completely overhauled, with new curricula on constitutional rights, unconscious bias, and community trust. Judge Williams herself helped design the programs, ensuring that every recruit learned not just the power of the badge, but the weight of accountability that came with it. The young law clerk who had sat in the back row during the proceedings, troubled by the familiarity of the woman in cuffs, found her life forever changed by what she had witnessed. Inspired by Judge Williams' courage, she went on to dedicate her career to civil rights law, joining the ACLU and fighting similar battles in courtrooms across the country, a living testament to how one act of truth could inspire a lifetime of advocacy. The video of the trial, released to the public, became the most watched courtroom footage in internet history, viewed more than 50 million times within weeks. Commenters from around the world poured in their own stories of injustice, stories of brutality swept under the rug, of voices silenced, of lives shattered by unchecked authority. For the first time, many felt they had witnessed accountability delivered not just swiftly but perfectly, so publicly and so completely that it could not be denied. The footage was studied in police academies as a case study of what happens when authority is abused and when a system of silence collides with undeniable truth. 6 months later, the ripple effects were still unfolding. Federal oversight of the police department remained in place, with quarterly reviews ensuring reforms were not only implemented but sustained. Complaints were now tracked publicly, body camera footage was preserved with automatic redundancies, and officers who once believed their word would always be law now understood that every action could and would be scrutinized. National conversations erupted about broader reform, with lawmakers citing the Williams case as proof of why accountability measures had to be expanded across the country. As for Judge Williams, she carried the bruise that had once humiliated her not as a scar but as a symbol of the turning point. She continued presiding over cases with the same fairness she always had, but now every defendant who walked into her courtroom knew that the woman behind the bench was not just a judge in title, but a living example of what it meant to stand against injustice. Her presence reminded everyone that justice was not abstract, not distant, but human and resilient. And though she carried herself with the same quiet dignity as before, those who looked closely could see the fire in her eyes had only grown brighter. Martinez, sitting in his cell, thought often of the moment when he chose to strike her, the moment when he believed she was powerless, the moment when he thought the system would shield him as it always had. He replayed it endlessly, wondering how he had failed to see who she was, how he had underestimated her so completely, but his regret changed nothing. He would spend 25 years behind bars, not as an officer shielded by authority, but as an inmate stripped of power, a man reduced to a cautionary tale. And in the city beyond, people spoke of that morning as the day justice hit back. Parents told their children the story of the black woman who had been slapped and handcuffed on the steps of her own courthouse, only to return in her robes, reclaim her bench, and deliver a verdict that reshaped an entire system. Teachers used it as a lesson in civics, activists as a rallying cry, lawyers as a case study, citizens as a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, stood above the law. The end. If you followed this story to the end, you've seen how justice can turn on a single moment and reshape an entire system. I want to hear what you think about this plot. Was the ending what you expected, or did the twist surprise you? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and share your thoughts about Judge Williams and the downfall of Officer Martinez. Your voice matters, and I'd love to know how this story resonates with you. If you believe more people should hear stories where corruption is exposed and courage triumphs, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story, because every week we explore narratives that hold a mirror to power and remind us what true justice looks like.